So please welcome to the stage Francesca Hillery, Alexandra Peak, Sasha Stashwick, and Vivek Shastry for a panel on advancing climate justice through direct air capture.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on advancing climate justice through direct air capture. My name is Dr. Vivek Shastry, and I'm a senior research associate at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And we extend a very warm welcome to the speakers on this panel. Francesca Hillery is the Communications and Program Director for Global Ocean Health and Building Tribal Leadership in Carbon Removal. Sasha Stashwick is the Director of Policy at Carbon 180. And before this, she worked many years with NRDC as the Director of Industrial Policy. And Alexandra Peak is the environmental and climate justice strategist at Carbon Direct, where she works on environmental justice metrics for high quality CDR. So let's kick this off. Let's start with, for this audience and for, just for other people listening more broadly, could you describe your work in layman's terms? How do we understand your work in the simplest terms possible?
Hi, my name is Alexandra Peak. I am the Climate and Environmental Justice Strategist at Carbon Direct. Carbon Direct is a carbon management firm. What that means is we help our clients in their journey to decarbonize, both in reductions and removals. Carbon Direct found it very important to have an environmental justice in-house team to help to loop together how these sectors are interconnected. My background is in the social sciences. I'm a sociologist. I also did community organizing in Texas for several years. And part of my work at Carbon Direct is to, on the one hand, on our supply team, to evaluate projects based on their community engagements, making sure that they are pushing for equity more than basic equality. What that means is we look at two metrics: procedural equity, which is the seats at the tables equitable? Are the seats at the table the same people that have been at the crux of climate change injustices? And we also look at distributive equity. So are the harms and benefits being distributed according to historical trends of environmental injustices? So from our project side, I help to evaluate that to make sure that our projects have high quality. Most of our projects are looking at those that affect the global south. So that is very important work, since the history of it is rooted in a lot of inequities, especially economic and social. And on the other side, we also help clients that are building DAC hubs meet their community engagement plans so that they are in line with Justice 40, as well as any other prerogatives by the federal government in order to get funding. So that it looks like not only just community engagement plans, but how are we thinking about DAC in terms of equity? How are we thinking about DAC in terms of being How are we thinking about DAC in terms of being in the hands of those that have perpetuated injustices, and how can we level that playing field?
Yeah, so Francesca Hillery again. I work for a nonprofit in Washington State in the Puget Sound called Global Ocean Health. And but previous to that, for about a decade, I worked with the Tulalip tribes in Washington State, again on the Puget Sound, as a public affairs manager and communications person. And I did a lot of work in salmon recovery, communicating about the environment, habitat, whatnot. And one of my mentors there, Terry Williams, actually helped to found this program under Global Ocean Health called Building Tribal Leadership in Carbon Removal. And so many of the Puget Sound tribes have been dealing with ocean acidification for quite a long time now. And so that eventually led Terry to, he started to really become interested in carbon removal, what that would mean for the tribes. and really recognized so early on that it was going to be crucial for the tribes to wrap their heads around this. And that was really more focused on marine carbon removal at that point. But one thing we've done over the year, and I want to thank our funders, CZI, Additional Ventures, and Breakthrough, because it has allowed us to build or launch an independent tribal organization that will be self-governed amongst the 574 tribes if they all join. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and they're all self-governing. So they have, depending on where they are in the country, they have different needs. And so we've really spent the past year first aggregating and getting research together, building relationships with some of you in the room, which have been so helpful to us. And so, yeah, that's where we are right now. And we look forward to working with all of you in the future and helping to get this information out to the tribes so that they can make the best decisions for their communities around carbon removal.
Thank you. Stash.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Stashwick. I'm with Carbon 180. We are a nonprofit that is focused on advancing a vision of the carbon removal sector that really centers high accountability, justice, and equity. And a key perspective we bring to the table is that the sector needs to be rooted in the science, but also that the buy-in of communities that are hosting carbon removal projects is really critical to the ultimate success of the sector and getting it to the scale that we need. And within the organization, I am the director of policy. So my team looks after sort of the ways that we can influence the implementation of existing policies to achieve that vision and also fill policy gaps in advancement of that vision. So key focus areas for us are around implementation of the DAC Hubs program, which I'm sure we'll get into more. Obviously, the largest investment in commercial scale deployment of DAC anywhere in the world, but also issues around infrastructure, which we think are going to be really critical, potentially critical catalyzers or critical barriers to the deployment of DAC and to the success of the sector. And then also policy gaps on the market making side. So looking at demand side measures and ways that we can also build in really high standards and also center equity and justice in the markets that we're creating for technologies like DAC, including public procurement markets. I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you all so much for those introductions. So let's dig in for a couple of rounds between us, and then we'll open it up for questions for the last 6 to 8 minutes or so. Okay, perfect. So just digging into this intersection of DAC and community justice, right? So if we look at sort of the process of setting up a DAC and operating it. So whether it is how do we power it and what sources of power we use to power it, where we site it, what materials are used in the plant itself, or what happens to the carbon dioxide once that's taken out. Historically, there have been concerns at each of those stages in terms of community engagement and environmental justice. So could you outline sort of what, with respect to DAC, what some of those burdens or perceived burdens may be from a community perspective? And then also, how what are also some of the benefits that come along with this technology deployment?
I would say for the harms, something that really needs to be a priority for a project developer or any investors that are going to build a DAC hub is before it's really even in the pipeline that it is very site specific. So it's context specific. If you're going to make a DAC hub or build a DAC hub far out for example, the Stratos DAC hub being built by 1.5, obviously there's still going to be some form of community engagement, but there's less of the risk for them. I believe for that DAC hub, the nearest community is several hours away. So when you're not working with a fence line community, this helps to at least mitigate the risk and at the same time shoot up the benefits. So while you're doing this DAC hub, you can also create a local program in schools that inform about these technologies with also the framing as to why this is important and now. You can also help build a inclusive, equitable workforce. When you are working with a community that is what we consider an EJ community, environmental justice community, this means that historically this community has been placed near all types of energy infrastructure with several harms, ranging from incinerator plants, smelting plants, waste plants, oil and gas rigs. And so now this community has been what we call pollution overburden and have accumulative impacts to their health. When you're going into a community like that and you say, oh, we're also going to build this other facility, even if that facility that we know is not going to emit more or is there to extract from the emissions, this community is only hearing, we already have to deal with so many harms and so many cumulative impacts. Why are we also going to take the burden or the risk that comes with another facility? So there has to be that difference when you're going in, what type of location, and if you are going to be talking to a fence line community, these considerations have to be top mind. What do you do in that case? This is when community engagement at the early onset is very important, as well as clear transparency. Another benefit that can come from this that 1.5 has done with the community benefits plan is that they started to create citizen advisory boards. So now you have an accountability mechanism by community members that can either be spearheaded by local grassroots NGOs, local municipalities, or even individuals themselves to be part of these advisory boards to hold this process accountable, right? So even in the beginning, when you're promising communities, you're not going to get excess emissions. This is to take out emissions. There still has to also be through the process an open channel that goes back and forth, and that other benefits are coming from it, like the ones I listed, such as workforce development, community initiatives, and really to start integrating this technology on the ground level so that it is not seen as, you know, high in the sky, like here are the people in control doing what they need to do and they don't care about me. Like, we need to start bridging those gaps to realize that this technology is important for society first and foremost.
I would say that the difference with the tribes in regards to placing a DAC plant, you're not going to place a DAC plant on tribal land unless you've gone through a huge formal process with the tribe and they agree to it, right? And then as far as community benefits, I think that that's also something that the tribes will work out. But we've been working very closely with the Upper Nicola of British Columbia with their project partners with Carbon Engineering for a new plant that will, I think, be built, or they're starting to build in 2026. But in any case, the Upper Nicola are providing hydropower to that particular project. And so I think that, Indian country is actually going to start looking at these different technologies and processes differently. I mean, I have to say, just so far talking to some of the tribes, describing what DAC is, you pull the air out, you process it, and then you put it underground. They're okay with everything until you say you put it underground. So that's an interesting thing too. When you're talking to tribes, you really have to understand that each part of that process that you're proposing might be read differently to them, right? So, but yeah, I actually think that DAC represents a lot of opportunity, and I really think it's very interesting. Another description went a wire with me is I used Dr. Jennifer Wilcox's video wherein she calls DAC, synthetic forests, and that didn't go over great because of the word synthetic, right? So you really have to think through how tribes might take this stuff in. But yeah, I actually think there's a lot of opportunity for DAC, especially workforce development for tribes also is extremely important, and this represents some workforce of the future. So I think that that's a really good point to start talking about DAC with the tribes in regards to benefits.
Maybe I could introduce just like a perspective from the policy side around a program like DAC hubs and what we saw coming out of DOE in sort of their first round of awards that was announced in August. So I think that there were sort of the two big projects that got the lion's share of the attention, but really what DOE did was award 21 different projects at really different stages of development with a tremendous diversity within that, the cohorts. And so, the technologies are not monolithic, the communities are not monolithic, the geographies are not monolithic, the energy contexts are not monolithic, right? And so I think from our perspective, it was really positive that DOE actually funded such a diversity of projects, and it's exactly what an innovation program like DAC Hubs is intended to do, right? Yes, it's intended to help de-risk an emerging technology where you build first-of-a-kind commercial scale facilities, they come down in cost, you generate tremendous learnings, but we're also going to be generating tremendous learnings, around this whole range of, diverse perspectives and contexts. And many of the projects have really, have a diversity in terms of the stakeholder consortiums that have come around them. They're trying to put forward new kinds of models for bottom-up community-generated models for hubs, potentially public ownership models for hubs. So just as we're generating a lot of innovation and supporting innovation on the technology side, I think we're also generating through a program like that, through a policy like that, a lot of innovation on the process side, the idea is to really deliver, I think, a range of models as we deliver a range of technologies, and I think it can be responsive to the needs of different communities.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. I think as we have more experiments in different spaces, we uncover not only different technological options for innovation, but also on the community front, how do you uncover these different dynamics and how do you address them? So as each of you are interacting with communities and community partners or tribes, or at that interface with policy, we've been through these similar processes before for other technologies, right? Whether it's fracking or siting of power plants, we've had some learnings with respect to environmental justice concerns and how do we address them. Now, when it comes to DAC, what's different or what's similar? As you're having these conversations, what are some of the biggest unknowns, would you say, like things we still don't know too much about?
I would say what's different about DAC is what we make of it right now. Because as it is now, there's not enough proof and evidence for communities to believe that it's anything different than what they've seen before. And then we are, of course, also talking about, are we talking about this within the United States, with most DAC hubs being here, but when we're talking about the Global South, I think the risks are even higher because the Global South has just been an experiment ground for renewable energy technologies, for development projects or initiatives. So to me, the stakes are even higher within the context of an area that has just been faced with way more of the burdens. And what DAC can do differently is completely reverse that by showing transparency, being engaged early on, and also to disclose what this technology is meant to do, even if it is to also generate profits or to generate a different business. That should also be disclosed alongside with the benefits, the co-benefits, because peddling one over the other could be disingenuous. And I think that is probably what, in my experience working with communities, both within the US and abroad, is just be transparent. And even if answers aren't yet found about this technology and how we're scaling it, that has to be disclosed as well.
I think for tribes, so much of social justice ends up coming through the court system. The tribes are written into, the treaties with the tribes are not like other treaties that the United States has signed on to. Whereas if the United States were to pull out of the Pacific Salmon Treaty, the United States' sovereignty would not be affected. But the United States is the United States because of those treaties that were signed along the way out to the West Coast. And so the treaties are written into US law. And even though it's taken us so long to get justice, it is and it has been happening through the courts. And so I would caution that that would be a way that the tribes would deal with any trouble that would arise from this new industry. That eventually you would end up in court.
On the question of what is potentially different about DAC, one of the reasons I was attracted to this work is that I'm well into my second decade of climate advocacy, and I've worked on a variety of sectors. And in sectors like the power sector, other sectors, we're quite late to the game, and we're having to turn around a really, really big ship. I think here there's a massive opportunity to build this sector, effectively a new sector of the American economy and the world economy, differently from the start. And to the extent that we can do that, I think there's huge potential to build more durable political coalitions, to have more host communities that want to come out and support DAC projects, other carbon removal projects. And you really can imagine a scenario where the sector gets built in a way that just reinforces pre-existing environmental burdens and harms. But you can also imagine an alternative world where we build it in a way that actually seeks to redress those burdens and harms. And so for me, that is kind of the central opportunity here. We're not late, or we're not as late, and we'd be much better off building it differently from the get-go than trying to turn things around later. I think high profile failures of the kinds that I think we're all thinking about could really set us back quite a bit. But on the contrary, the opportunity is to create real momentum and the conditions for a lot more policy support that we're going to need over the next decades.
Let's move to that policy support, right? In terms of we talked about the burdens, but in terms of the solutions or the mechanisms that are available for communities to participate in this process of understanding what DAC is, and participate in the process of where do they get cited, and what are the risks of the technology to our communities, and what are the benefits, and how do we take these decisions? So what mechanisms exist currently for communities to engage in that process, and are they sufficient, or are there gaps in terms of would policies need to be updated, whether it is the environmental impact assessments or mechanisms through the Clean Water Act? Are there sufficient pathways for communities to engage?
I was for once going to make a not policy point, but I can jump in. This is just one piece, but I'm sure we'll build on this. One thing that Carbon 180 does is we have a regranting initiative, because our perspective is that communities need to be empowered to be sitting at these tables and engaging at these tables themselves, and so we're really there to grant them funding to support their ability to do that, provide a certain amount of education to, really just create, a basic level of understanding of what is carbon removal, what is a technology like DAC, and the idea there is that we are not an EJ organization, but we want to be in support of EJ organizations that again are non-monolithic. It's going to vary depending on what community the groups are in, but really trying to seek out organizations that are accountable and responsive to the actual communities where they are operating, and so can even begin to engage in processes like community benefit plan discussions with project developers and with agencies like the Department of Energy. So that's just an example of something that's going on that, at least at Carbon 180.
Yeah, so some policies that have been really helping with this is the DOE's applications for grants. So project developers, we were just speaking of the two big ones, yes, but there are several others. But part of the application process is a very rigorous, in-depth community engagement plan. And this also includes a community benefits plan, but what I really liked about their application is there's a series of interviews, there's a lot of proof and verification that these plans already be put into motion, that there's collaborations, that there's partnerships. So having more of this as a need to, in order to get funding, not just from DOE funding, but from states, would be very helpful to advance DAC and make sure that it also is encompassing communities. When it is an afterthought, that is when a lot can fall through the cracks. So if it's something that you need to do, when I say you, a project developer needs to do in order to get this funding, is pretty much that you first have to show they have community engagement. These types of policies can help push that and also start build support as this happens more within states, so that communities can also support each other across state lines if that's necessary.
So I live in Washington State, and we recently passed the Climate Commitment Act a couple years ago. And part of that is sort of a redistribution of funds to the tribes, up to $10 billion over 10 years, I believe, which is, meant for restoration and a lot of the work that the tribes already do with recovery, habitat recovery. And so it's things like that, and I do think that there are parts of Justice 40, although I really can't speak to all of the issues with the tribes simply because they are different. But I know that the Climate Commitment Act is going to make a huge difference in Washington State for the tribes, and I think that part of that is based on just the state and voters being willing to allow it to happen, just let go of that, control over resources. And we're really excited to see what shakes out in the coming years. And yeah, last year we got carbon removal monies put into that as well. So.
Okay. We'll move on to Q&A in 5 minutes. But before we do that, I just wanted to give a space. Y'all have been, y'all come from a climate justice and environmental justice, a community advocacy background. And as you look, at this horizon of this new technology deployment, is there anything that keeps you up at night on like things that could really affect the community or derail it? Is there anything that keeps you up at night?
I think that one thing that really concerns me is I sometimes fear that, and look what we've been through in the last couple of years, really, 3 or 4 if you count, Australian wildfires starting in, 2019. It's just been a heck of a few years climate-wise. And one thing that I worry about sometimes is that all this emerging tech isn't taking into effect the climate conditions that we might be faced with. I mean, what happens to a big DAC plant and then you have a huge wildfire like they've been having in Canada, right? It's stuff like that. I do hope that more thought goes into how do these technologies survive floods, and like what are the issues around the actual climate that we're going to be going through as we're building out this infrastructure.
One thing keeps me up at night. I'm a very sound sleeper, but I guess things that I, am concerned about is I worry about this technology further alienating people into different camps, like further alienating like developers, those in the climate sector space, from those actually being affected from climate change. And I think I also worry about the framing. Yes, this is technology and innovation, and government has to play its part, public-private investments. But the framing is also, why are we in the position now that we have to remove CO2? Why are we in this position? And this is when climate justice concerns are first and foremost. And those that are polluting and emitting the most are not the ones that are facing the most of the consequences. So when these same actors are, spearheading technologies to remedy this and removing legacy emissions, that's important, yes, but the framing and the connection back to the ground is very important. The global level must also be informed by what's happening at the local level. And so, yes, I guess one of my concerns is that this is just further like pushing people into like different camps when this requires an all hands approach.
I guess I worry about the big stuff that probably a lot of people in this room worry about, which is, this technology or these technologies being, co-opted by, the same interests that caused the problems in the first place. But I want to try and maybe end on like a more positive note, which is that I think there's all of these different ways that we can support, incremental movement towards a really alternative vision for this technology and for this sector, and as a result, an alternative center of gravity. And I tend to be a person that's like pretty comfortable with just like small incremental, like, kind of steps forward, directionally correct movement. But I think we really need to be kind of aligned in that direction. I'll just use an example. The DOE put out a set of principles for responsible carbon management. There's some good stuff in there. It's imperfect. They took a lot of comments on it. I'm sure they're going to work to improve it. It's at the end of the day, it's a voluntary thing. There's not a big stick that they can wield to, they don't have any enforcement authorities around it. But there's all these different ways that the people in this room can work to sort of support that effort and try and build in more of an incentive structure around that type of vision for the development of this sector. And I think that has real potential to create, that alternative center of gravity that we need, that is the antidote to a co-opted vision for a technology like DAC. And so that's kind of where I try and orient myself when I'm kept up at night by those thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. I think that what I heard from what I'm hearing from all of you is, it's important to recognize the historical contexts in which these developments are happening, but we have an opportunity here to get in front of them early on and be transparent about what do we know, what do we not know, and how do we create more mechanisms for people to engage in this process, understand this process, and benefit from this deployment. So let's open it up. Maybe we'll take 1 or 2 rounds of questions. We do have 10 minutes. Gentleman over there, please.
Hi, I'm Andrew from Counteract, a VC in CDR. Thank you, first of all, for an amazing panel. I've heard a lot of talk on this subject, but never so much specificity. And it's great to see real, clear action we can take. And really inspiring, so thank you. I guess my question is, the US is the leader in this space, unquestionably, and so it's right that we're asking these questions first in the US. But I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is climate justice internationally. And I guess thinking about really well-intentioned policies, like, for example, the amazing policy set that we have here in the US, helping finance the DAC hubs and the IRA framework more broadly, or the NDC framework, for example, or the European emissions trading scheme, they tend to create incentives for technology to gravitate towards traditional financing centers. A lot of the companies that I talk to in the developing world are trying to figure out how they can become a US company so they can tap into that money. And that's natural, but it's also sad. And I wonder, internationally right now, whether we're creating policy sets that actually are unhelpful from a climate justice point of view, even though they're doing a huge amount of good for the DAC sector, because they're helping catalyze change, because they are, magnetically drawing innovation and entrepreneurship to the US, I think to Europe, to the UK, because those are where the policies are moving first. And I wonder what we can think about as we sort of evolve this sector together to help ensure that actually the developing world it can benefit from all of this money. Should it be possible, for example, for a company that's doing its first project in a global south, DAC hub to benefit from 45Q to be able to sell removals into the EU ETS. And wouldn't that be the most catalytic thing that we could do from a climate justice point of view if we think worldwide?
I agree that this technology needs to be diversified and really supported in the global south. The DAC hub in Kenya, Octavia, Carbon is an example of how this technology can scale, especially in the continent of Africa, which has the geologic conditions for sequestration, most importantly. But your question really touches on a global mindset that needs to start reversing if these technologies are going to be equitable. Right now, or what has been, is that minerals, raw materials, cheap labor is extracted from the south or the periphery to feed the core, right? And this involves anything from R&D to our phones, our technologies, and even to what we put into DAC hubs. So we're still, into that mechanism of how goods and technologies flow. And so what I'm hearing is your question is like, how do we start then reversing that trend? And that's going to take several different sectors and actors to work cohesively to do that, with the embodied vision that this has to be reversed, where investments aren't always R&D isn't always just spearheaded in the US, and if it is, how do we start democratizing that technology and that engineering? So I don't really have an answer for you specifically. I'm not sure if my fellow panelists do, but I do agree that we have to start to, not just us, the global south has to start valuing what they have. The value is the ground, the value is the minerals. And until that value is not seen as intrinsic and it's elsewhere, then that's very hard to then change the mentality.
I'm quickly outside my expertise in this, but maybe I'll offer just like two quick thoughts. I think from a policy perspective, from a US policy perspective, but I think potentially European as well. I think the value I see in a deployment incentive and innovation policy like DAC hubs, for example, is, yes, we're going to build projects in the US, but you're building that first, second, third commercial scale project. You're de-risking that technology. You're going to start bringing it. The idea, right, is to start bringing it, down the cost curve, and the value of that is that the fourth, fifth, sixth, 100th, project is better, cheaper, And I think to a large extent, that's the role of developed countries like the United States, is to de-risk those technologies that can then deploy around the world to reach the scales that we need to reach. We're not going to reach those scales just by deploying it in the United States and other developed countries. So that's sort of one thought. And then the second major role I think U.S. policy has to play is in standard setting, right? So when you have, the U.S. federal government for the first time, for example, stepping up to say we're going to purchase carbon removal as a public good, really all long duration forms of carbon removal, but to include direct air capture, the standards that get set around that have a value far beyond like those specific tons that get purchased, right? You could really raise boats across public and private markets for the off-takers of carbon removal projects. And so I think those types of, sort of innovation deployment policies and the standard setting role are two really unique ways that developed countries like the US really contribute to that ultimate North Star that we're all going for.
That's great. We have time for one more question, and I saw a hand up there before.
Hi, I'm Max Pashota. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. And the question that I really have is, given that there's really no precedent for what a fair or equitable community benefits plan looks like, and the fact that despite having good intentions, direct air capture developers have a conflict of interest when advising communities as to what that looks like, whose job is it, would you say it is, to empower and set these precedents such that the communities being impacted know that their community benefits agreement is actually in their best interest?
I would say the responsibility is it's on both sides. Yes, I agree that there is already a conflict of interest. If someone already that's advising a client is coming in because it's kind of like, okay, this is who I am representing in this case. That effort can still be genuine. And also, I think it's very important that, which is already happening, a lot of grassroots local organizations are really spearheading this and making sure that their questions are being answered. And if not, they're very loud about it, which is very important. I know a lot of us here can be kind of, upset with the media or how the media portrays things, but the media is still playing a very important role. It's putting out forward any of the concerns. It then gives us, those that are working and creating these projects, to see what the concerns are and who are the community organizations or members there that are vocal about it, to meet them where they're at. I don't think there's anyone in particular that it's their responsibility. I think everyone has their part to play, and everyone is playing it. Some organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network, for example, is very much in the front row of CDR and making sure that it is being equitable and beneficial to those in the South. The Black Hive Fund is another one that's doing a lot of community engagement around EJ injustices and what CDR means for them. So this is already happening, right? Organizations and grassroots organizations are not oblivious to what's happening. It's us that have to meet them where they're at and not see them as adversaries.
Yeah, and again, because the tribes are different and their special relationship with the federal government, I think that that's going to be worked out and deployed sometime soon, in the sense of, how to build that capacity within tribes to even think through, some tribes, to think through these issues. Other tribes are going to have a team of lawyers looking through it, and all kinds of other folks working for tribal government. There's a difference across Indian country in that respect. But I would say, I think that there will be we already have special consultation between the tribes, the feds, and the states, supposedly. That doesn't always work out very well. But we do have a precedent in Indian country for this, so I imagine that we'll be following along that route.
We have 30 seconds. Sasha, you get the last word.
Maybe I'll just say that from an NGO perspective, I think it's really incumbent in our community to develop a set of criteria for what constitutes a good DAC hub, a good DAC project. I think in the absence of that, what we're seeing is that people are using as a proxy for that who owns the hub or who is doing the project. But what we really need is to define a specific vision of what does success look like, and then invest people in that success. And so I think that's the work, at least for our community, at least part of the work for our community, is to really develop those criteria.
That's a great place to close. Please join me in thanking all of the panelists today for your time and this discussion. Thank you.